Welcome to a new episode of our Galley Tower Sessions presenting great vintage guitars. As usual, we bring this series to you from Florin Media in Landau, Germany, with a new episode aired every month. Today we deviate somewhat from our usual offerings, which have focused on vintage guitars, mostly archtops, made in the United States. The land of the brave and free perhaps, but most certainly of the greatest steel string guitars ever made anywhere in the world. Dominant as they have been in that territory, just like the Roman Empire was in its day all over the old world. The whole world? Wait a moment, not quite, as there was this little stretch in Gallia where, you know what I mean. It does feel, indeed, a bit like an Asterix move to introduce two European-made vintage guitars that can hold a candle to the US-made armada of steel strings. While this could not be said for any European-made flat tops or F-hole archtops in the vintage period, it must be said about a distinct relative of the American archtop, the so-called Gypsy or Manouche guitars that were made mostly in France from the 1930s onward. These are fascinating instruments, every bit as good as the best US-made guitars and very different in design and construction, which is not surprising as they also lend themselves to a unique brand of jazz guitar playing that is associated with the name of Django Reinhardt and the Hot Club of Paris. I must admit that I have only more recently begun to understand the hype around these vintage Selmer, Busato or Favino guitars when I had a chance to play a whole lot of them owned by a European collector, along with some great US-made archtops. Since my knowledge and understanding of these guitars is nowhere near the level of my knowledge of American steel strings, I better stick to the basics here and rely on the judgment of others who have specialized on Manouche guitars, such as François Charles, who wrote the book on Selmer Machiavelli instruments. Today we have two legendary guitars from this French tradition to compare. A Busato Grand Modèle 44 from around 1940 and the famous Selmer Orchestra or Jazz model from 1941, one of the few that bear the inscription Django Reinhardt Modell. Django Reinhardt is of course mostly associated with his Selmer guitars, but also reportedly owned at least one Busato, on which he is rumored to have written the ballad Anouman. But let's begin with the beginning. The Selmer, the famous guitar Django Reinhardt played. It all started with Mario Machiavelli, an Italian immigrant to France, a luthier and classical guitarist who had innovative ideas about improving on the guitar as an instrument, whom the Selmer company in Paris was willing to give a chance in 1931. Soon after this, he came up with instruments that had quite distinctive features, which worked together so well as to make the word spread. His guitars featured aluminium truss rods, back and sides were made of multiply laminate, to add strength for using steel strings and also add percussiveness, closed tuners, and best of all, a cutaway. These early Selmer Machiavelli guitars had volume and cutting power in spades, which made them the ideal instruments for ensemble play, where the guitar had to compete with violins, maybe accordions or even brass. When a certain gypsy artist from Belgium took up a Selmer Machiavelli guitar and made splashes with his Quintet du Haut Club de France, the way was paved for success for these guitars. So what's the secret behind the sound? We already mentioned the laminated lumber. In addition, it has a very long scale of over 26 inches long length. Another unique feature was the dipped top, bent slightly downwards right behind where the bridge sits. A construction detail that the Italian national Macaferri adopted from the Neapolitan mandolin, the instrument with the quickest response of the type he was after for his guitars. Mandolin-like appeared also the ebony bridge that was not glued but just sat on the top, held merely by string pressure, with two prolonged endings reminiscent of a moustache. Another factor influencing the sound was the bracing pattern, which consisted of 4 main transversal struts and 4 smaller struts running longitudinally. The necks were made of walnuts, sometimes 3 pieces, sometimes 1, reinforced, as mentioned, by aluminium strips. Fingerboards were flat and extending over the body into the era of a rather large D-shaped sound hole in these earlier Selmer Macaferri guitars. Now, these guitars became popular with guitar players in France, who appreciated the playability, the cutting quality, and the quick tonal responses that allowed for rapid single note playing as well as for a highly accentuated rhythm style, all of which made them ideally suited for the music we know as gypsy jazz. But mind you, these earlier guitars were still only built of 14 frets free of the body. After Mario Macaferri's departure from Selmer over a contractual dispute, and a transitional period in which the company didn't seem to have a clear sense of where to go with these guitars, the famous model finally took shape that we have here. The 14-fret Django guitar, or often simply referred to as the Selmer. The guitar with the unmistakable smaller oval sound hole in horizontal direction, starting around serial number 400. As already mentioned, Django himself was extremely pleased with this new model, and although he had already endorsed the 12-fret Macaferri Selmer guitars, he would really become one with this new and exciting jazz model. When Selmer first presented him their 14-fret version, Django immediately took to it and stuck to it for the rest of his life, becoming a sponsored ambassador for his make wherever he would perform. For example, when he went on a tour to the US in 1946 to perform alongside Duke Ellington, he didn't take his guitar with him, assuming he would have a choice of instruments over there. But he quickly had to realize that none of the US-made instruments suited his style, and quickly ordered a Selmer to be sent to him from France. Shortly before the outbreak of the war, and as a reflection of the growing popularity of Django, the company started to put the inscription Modelle Django Reinhardt on the central part of the slotted headstocks of their guitars. This inscription only appeared on instruments built between mid-1939 and mid-1940s, after which it was abandoned. So what we have here marks this guitar with the serial number 510 as one of only about 40 or 50 that have this extra badge of honor. Also, Django's last personal guitar was only 7 serial numbers away from this one, bearing number 503. That's quite cool, don't you think? Now, would the happy individual named Duigon, who received this guitar according to the ledger books that Selmer kept, on December 13th in 1941 in his home in Nantes could have guessed what it would be worth today, he or she might just have opened the case, banged away on the new possession. Well, nice guitar. Well, let's hear it a bit. There's a lot of power coming out of this rather lightweight beast, I have to say. Very impressive. Great bass response, and of course the famous singing trebles is all there in this guitar. Well, as expected. Now, let's compare this with a guitar that looks very similar, and for a good reason. This one was made by Busato, and like literally all other makers of Manouche guitars of that period, this other Italian immigrant to France started out copying the guitars of Machiavelli that Mario had designed for the Selmer company. So in a sense we compare the original with the replica here, but that shouldn't fool us into assuming the latter must be inferior. It may be a bit like in the history of American archtops when everyone started out, at least first, by copying Gibson's L5 that Lloyd Law had designed. But when, say, such a copyist went by the name of John D'Angelico, you knew that his version would at least be able to play in the same league as the original. So what makes the comparison interesting here is that the Busato, although inspired by the Selmer, doesn't really sound like a Selmer, but it sounds like, well, a Busato. And that appears to be true to several aspects. Busato was a talented maker in his own right who tried to improve on the Selmer construction by adding some of his own distinctive touches. The most significant such deviation from the original was that in the 1940s, Busato began to heat press the back of his guitars to form a distinctive arch, and his tops tended to be more arched than those of his competitors too. Maybe he was unwilling to just make too exact a copy, as his work tended to bear the marks of a genius that doesn't waste time by paying too much attention to detail. And this guitar certainly is a good example of this. You don't even have to look too closely to notice that the workmanship can in parts only be labeled a little crude. But just in passing, I'd like to mention this as we live in a time of machine-made exactness, which often produces, well, less than inspiring things that all look the same, feel the same, and in the case of music-making tools, sound the same. This is not to say that the Busato would not have sounded as great as it does had its maker, whether Bortello himself or one of his several assistants that all came from Italy, had they paid a little more attention to detail. It might have sounded just as great or even better, But what we can say is that this one does sound fabulous, just the way it was put together by the man. Responsive to the lightest touch. If you think of the music that these guitars are typically associated with, you'd think of a rather fierce attack on the Argentine strings by way of using a super heavy plectrum. It's not a style that I can play, I wish I could, but what has really surprised me here with any of the great vintage Manouche guitars I was lucky to play is that they are by no means limited to just this style or approach. And I think this also comes out very nicely in the related video in which Kevin and Tobias present the two here in a wonderful original composition of Kevin's. I redo this. And this comes also and this comes out also very nicely in the related video, do check it out, in which Kevin and Tobias present the Selmer and the Busato in a wonderful original composition of Kevin's. Now, how do they compare the Selmer and the Busato? You will have got your own impression, but I could give you mine. But instead, let me give you a longer quote from Michael Horowitz, owner and creator of Django Books. He was more qualified than I am to say something about the distinctive tone differences here. So, quote from Michael, "What makes a Busato so great? First off, they are positively the loudest guitars ever made. A good Favino is pretty loud, but the Busato is just a cannon." The Busato has three tonal elements which really make it cut in the acoustic settings. First, extremely dry. It has little or no natural wetness. This makes the guitar much more focused and is therefore much easier to hear in a loud jam setting. Second, the tone is very pure with very simple overtones. And third, it responds to the lightest touch. Busatos yield an exceedingly wide frequency response. They have a crisp, bright high end, which gives you leads some sparkle and adds ambience and clarity to rhythm work. There's not much mids except for a slight upper mid-range nasality. Construction details with this one are 16 inches and 1/4, which makes for a rather large guitar of the type. Well, the Grand Modèle. The typical super long scale of 675 millimeters, which is 26.5 inches. It sure stretches your fingers, but also makes for the necessary string tension for the silver-wrapped round core strings that work best with these instruments. These strings tend to have considerably lower pressure than steel strings with a 6 core. But with normal such steel strings, these guitars would be very, very hard to play and much less pleasant sounding. The body is just shy of 4 inches depth. The nut has a traditional 1 3/4 inches. Top is spruce. Back and sides are made of walnut. Heavy fingerboard and ebony binding, no plastic here. Tailpiece and tuners are the coveted original BBs. I'm not sure it can be seen here. Made by the SB company, but customized for Bortello Busato. No truss rod here, and a very lightweight of just under 4 pounds. Like many Busatos, it has lost its label if it ever had one, so the year can only be given by way of comparison with others. And this model is the most sought after from the Busato catalogue, preferred by pros like Stochello, Romane or Moreno. That's the Busato.